Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 2 discussion. Grinding Gear Games today dropped the major live stream announcement for everything that PathOfExile 2 is going to look like when early access starts in 15 days time. Now, there's a lot to unpack in this, and there's also more that you can watch as well. I've gone through and recorded everything that I can find, wrote it down into a bunch of notes, and I'll go through that now in this video. But there's also probably going to be things that I missed. So if you want to check out Grinding Gear Games' official launch video and discussion, I'll put a link to that down below as well. Important to note that there's a number of things in there that only appear for a couple of frames, so happy hunting. As I said, there'll be things you'll find I didn't find, there'll be things I found you didn't find. Let's start though with the highest level overview of what they're doing with PathOfExile 2. This is going into early access. What that means is that it is not yet at a point where they are willing to call a game completely finished. That means that there's going to be things that need to be improved in the future. Now, one thing that they've made a decision to do, and I think this was the right decision, is to go the opposite way of where Last Epoch went when they had a game that was almost release worthy, but still needed a bit more polish put on it. With Last Epoch, the game polished the campaign first, and left the endgame a bit sparse. And that's the way that Last Epoch still is today. I do think it is the second best ARPG on the market at the moment. I do recommend playing it, but it is something that will feel like there's just not quite enough to do once you get to endgame proper. And of course, this is Editing God coming in here and saying that if you haven't yet tried Last Epoch and you're interested in picking up a copy of it, I do have an affiliate link on my Nexus store, which I'll put a link to down in the description below. What PathOfExile 2 is doing is instead focusing some of that work on the end game at the expense of the later half of the campaign. As we go into early access, Acts 1, 2, and 3 will be present. Once you complete Act 3, you go on back to the start of Act 1, and you'll be repeating it on what they're terming cruel difficulty. This is something that was around early in PathOfExile 1's lifetime as well. Once you complete Act 3 on cruel difficulty, then you gain access to the end game. The drawback for this is pretty obvious. It's going to mean that the earlier acts are going to feel a bit stale. The benefit though is that they've been able to cram quite a lot of time into the endgame proper. We will discuss the endgame at length in this video. We'll get to there in a sec, but there's a couple of other things I want to discuss. And in the background, let's have some images from the official press kit. If you want to download a copy of this for yourself, something you might consider using as a wallpaper, you can get that from Grinding Gear Games' official website. And there's a lot of good wallpapers in there. The first thing that stood out to me is that they are totally overhauling the way that items work from PathOfExile 1, but they're doing it in a way that's quite subtle. Almost all of your favorite currency orbs from PoE 1 will be returning, but not all of them. And they're doing massive transformations in the rarity of various currencies. So, in PathOfExile 1, we have the Exalted Orb. Very rare currency, not as valuable now as it used to be, but it is a very rare currency item. In PathOfExile 2, Exalted Orbs are going to be so common that by the time you finish Act 1, you're probably going to have 6 or 7 of them. One of the core early upgrade pipelines for items is going to be to start an item, you pick up a magic item on the ground, or maybe even a scoured item, you transmute it, you augment it so that it's got 2 mods on it, and then after that, you apply a Regal Orb to it, Regal Orbs being more common than in PoE 1, but still not very common. That'll be something you'll have a little bit of trouble finding. And then you exalt it out. You fill it up with mods using Exalted Orbs. This is something that you would never do in PathOfExile 1. At the same time, certain things that you consider to be pretty trivial to use in PathOfExile 1, Alteration Orbs, Orbs of Scouring, these are just not going to exist at all in PathOfExile 2. What they're going for is a situation where the initial configuration of mods on an item is really important. And additionally, if you're able to get an item that has a number of particularly good mods on it, that becomes a valuable starting point for potential crafting. So you're not going to be able to reset an item the way you can in PoE 1, and that's going to mean that initial configuration matters. But then at the same time, you will still have a few more advanced tools, such as Orbs of Annulment and various metamods that we'll get to later on. Metamods that don't work the same way at all that they did in PathOfExile 1, but that provide quite a lot of interesting options. Essentially, the core fundamentals of the way that PathOfExile 2 crafting is going to work adding mods to an item is going to be trivial, removing them is going to be hard. Whereas in PathOfExile 1, it's sort of a bit all over the place. Sometimes adding mods is easy and so is removing them, like on a magic item. But on a rare item, adding mods is quite hard. It requires the rare Exalted Orb. Removing mods is something you can do with a Scouring Orb, a Chaos Orb, a whole bunch of different things. It's reasonably easily done. PoE 2, very different approach. The second topic I want to talk about here is the topic of Ascendancies. Now, you will have 3 Ascendancies for each class eventually, but they may not all be present during early access. Additionally, of the 12 classes that Grinding Gear Games are intending to have in the game for full release, we're only going to have 6 of them on day 1. There are going to be 3 different ways that you can ascend. This is very different to PathOfExile 1, which forces you into the Labyrinth. The Labyrinth is a wide divergence from normal gameplay loop of PathOfExile. Now what PathOfExile 2 is going to do here, it's going to maintain that it is a vast divergence from the core gameplay loop, but it's also going to do that in a very different way. Instead of going to the Labyrinth, your first option is going to be to do content that is reasonably similar to the Sanctum mechanics from PathOfExile 1. Your second option is going to be to engage in content that is reasonably similar to Ultimatum from PathOfExile 1. There will also be a third option that's added, but that will not be in the game until PathOfExile 2 releases Act 4 at some point during the early access period, because it's tied to the Act 4 content, and so it's not something you'll have access to early on. Now my read on this is that Grinding Gear Games want to have some content that is extraordinarily difficult for bot cheaters to beat. The part of the reason for that is that bots are something that haven't really been an issue in PathOfExile 1 for a while, at least farming bots. Trade bots definitely are a big thing there, but farming bots have been something Grinding Gear Games seem to have been quite effective at mitigating in recent times. But farming bots can absolutely destroy a game's economy. They can make it so that a whole bunch of content isn't worth doing at all, because bot cheaters can do it better and they end up just flooding the markets with its rewards. What I think they're trying to do here is generate some content that is extremely hostile to botters, and as a result, anyone that wants to get a bot to the point that it's an efficient farmer at endgame is going to have to devote real human time to it, because both Sanctum and also the Ultimatum content are going to be quite hostile to that type of cheat. At the same time, I think that beating these will be very doable for an ordinary player once they've got a couple of extra levels. I want to contrast this a bit to the first Labyrinth in PathOfExile. If you're an experienced player, you're pretty good with these traps now, and you can do that on a character that's maybe level 30 and that hasn't really started to come together as a build yet. However, for a veteran player, you don't actually gain that much more power in the Labyrinth just by building your character up to be stronger. The main reason for that is that the thing that's probably killing you if you're failing in the first Labyrinth is the various trap gauntlets, and those trap gauntlets scale with your character's power. Or to be a little bit more precise here, the amount of damage that you suffer from traps is a function of the amount of life and the amount of energy shield your character's got. So increasing your life pool paradoxically actually makes these things hit harder and doesn't make it easier. It makes it harder because it puts more pressure on your life recovery than it would otherwise have. So leveling up doesn't make the Labyrinth easier. Contrast this to the new implementation of Sanctum, the Trials of the Sehkma, where gaining additional levels is going to mean that you will be able to clear through the area faster and focus more on defeating the traps. But also, your character's defenses are going to result in you being tougher in the Sanctum as well. So there's a whole bunch of things working together to mean that once you've picked up 3, 4, 5 levels more than you're intended to have, you should be able to just go back and absolutely crush that content, assuming that you're a human being doing it. It's much harder for a bot to do it, and I think that's the intention here. The key difference though is you're going to have some choice here. You're going to have some flexibility in the exact way you want to handle it, and that's going to be something very interesting. They haven't spoiled very much of what's contained in the actual Ascendancies themselves. There are a few little things like the Acolyte of Chayula that we had on the screen before, and the Witch Blood Mage Ascendancy. There's a couple of other ones as well, and they've been collected together on the PathOfExile 2 subreddit, but there's not a huge amount of information. I think this is something that they're sitting on to tease out over the next little while. But let's face it, I know why you're all here. You're here because you want to know about PathOfExile 2's endgame. What is it going to look like when you start running maps? And how are they going to be organized? What sort of equivalents to PathOfExile 1's Atlas are we going to have? And how exactly is that going to work? Well, this is in many ways a spiritual successor to Delve, maybe with elements of synthesis, and maybe with elements of Last Epoch's monolith system as well. This is what the Endgame Atlas is going to look like. However, all you can see here is one screen of it. This is going to extend enormously in all directions. So essentially, the Atlas is going to be a true Atlas. It's going to be an overworld map, and you're going to be able to travel to various new points on it and socket in one of the new equivalents of map items, which will then allow you to open up a map, travel to that map, and there's a number of things about the zones that you'll encounter that will modify the way that they'll play out in practice. For instance, this one is a forest biome. This one is a desert biome with Vaal corruption implied on top of it. And then there's these little icons that appear on top of them. For instance, you might see a breach icon here, and something here that I believe is the Ritual King of the Mists icon. One of the most fundamental things grinding gear games are doing differently in PathOfExile 2 to PathOfExile 1. In PathOfExile 1, it's pretty much a case of you choose 2 or 3 different areas of content that you want to run, and you spec absolutely all the support for those areas of content on the passive tree, and that's it. You then pretty much completely ignore all of the other areas of content. Let's say you want to be the best Legion farmer possible, you spec all of the Legion or almost all of the Legion, and then you probably go and block things like Breach, Harvest, Ritual and the like, unless you're also interested in dabbling in those content areas as well. In PathOfExile 2, the more that you run Breach, the more you will be able to invest in your breaches. But the investment that you gain from running that Breach content will not help you become better at running Delirium content. It will not help you become better at running Ritual content. It is only going to apply to breaches. And what this means is that instead of just taking everything related to Breach, you have to make some choices. Which particular clusters do I take? Which clusters do I ignore? Now, there's going to be a separate mini tree for each of the different areas of content that you can specialize in. Each of these areas of content is going to have a Pinnacle boss. On top of that, there will be shrines, strongboxes, and essences that will have nodes on the main Atlas tree. So that's going to be one main Atlas tree that's going to have those nodes, but then there's much smaller ones dedicated to all of those other mechanics that we mentioned. While you're exploring in the Atlas, you'll occasionally encounter various towers. What these towers will allow you to do is scout out quite a large area into the fog. There's a large fog of war at the edges of the arena that you can possibly see here. So if you have a look at this mountain map here, you'll see that to the left of it, there's a whole bunch of fog. If you were to find a tower somewhere in this area, then that would allow you to see deep into that fog. And additionally, those towers can then be socketed with a precursor tablet that will then modify all maps within a range of it. Now, those of you that have played Last Epoch will see some similarity to the way that Last Epoch handles its monoliths, but also there's a bit of a similarity to the way that sections used to work. There's a bit of a similarity to the way that synthesis used to work. A whole bunch of different mechanics that are sort of combining into something that's a little bit different, but that will be fairly grokkable, I believe. I don't think this is going to be something that feels super complex when you play around with it in practice, but it does seem to have a lot of potential for customization as well. Ultimately, the way that I think of these towers is a place that by putting a tablet in, you sort of turn it into a beacon that applies scarabs to all nearby maps. That's the way that I think of this as a PathOfExile 1 player, but we're going to develop our own intuition as to this over time. An example of what a tower can be socketed with will be a tablet that reads 6 maps within the range contain breaches, and all breaches within your maps have +1 clasped hand. Now, some of the really interesting play is going to come up when you start overlapping multiple of these together. Then you'll be able to do some really fascinating things with them. Now, towers and tablets should in theory allow you to focus on one area of the game that you really like. For instance, if Breach ends up being your favorite thing in PathOfExile 2, you'll be able to use these Breach-related tablets on all the towers that you encounter, and by doing that, you should be able to force there to be a Breach encounter in every single map that you run, and on top of that, be able to juice up those quite substantially. On top of that, though, overlapping towers will be a huge deal because some of these things don't just have additive rewards, but they're multiplicative, and as a result, they'll end up scaling up really high. Now, there's of course a bunch of other complexities as well. You'll see here that there's a number of areas that have got red on them. These areas are corrupted. Corrupted areas will have additional modifiers on them. One example of that is the PoE 2 equivalent of the Beyond mechanic, but there's probably going to be more of them as well. That's the only one we know about so far. Additionally, some maps will have a boss applying to them. Map bosses are something that's a little bit more of a big deal in PathOfExile 2. They're not going to drop a huge loot explosion. Instead, they're going to drop a small number of potentially very, very good items. One of the things that PathOfExile 2 is doing with itemization is making it so that item rarity, and I'm not just talking about player rarity as a stat here, I'm talking about all sorts of sources of the monster's rarity, the zone rarity, and the like. These are not just going to increase the type of item that you get from Scoured to Magic, Magic to Rare, Rare to Unique. As well as doing that, or perhaps instead of doing that, they will increase the quality of the item that you get. For instance, you might go from getting an item that's rare with 3 just completely random mods to having 4 mods that are biased towards higher tier mods, or perhaps to 5 mods that are biased towards even higher tier mods again. These will then have more chance of ending up being good, and even if they're not good yet, they're going to be in a better place if you do consider going down some of the meta crafting routes that we'll get to when we discuss Ritual. Why would I be linking Ritual and meta crafting together? You'll see on that one. Anyways, these map bosses are not going to drop a huge shower of loot, but they will drop loot that will be welcome, and you're only going to encounter about one of them every 4 maps. But just like those of you that are PoE 1 players will know, in Delve, only about 15% of zones are the frost biome, but if you really are set on focusing on the frost biome, you can definitely chase it down and spend maybe even half your time in the frost biome. I think it'll be very similar when we're talking about PathOfExile 2 and map bosses. You can probably spend half your time running maps that have a map boss attached to them. Now, there is a major philosophical shift from PathOfExile 1 here as well. In PathOfExile 2, if you die in a map, you cannot re-enter that map by any means. That map is over for you. Other players that are still in it, they can continue on if they want, but you cannot return to it. You do have 6 portals, but the purpose of those 6 portals is so that you can exit and re-enter, or so that you can bring in friends. It is not so that you can then go back in after having a death. This is going to change the way the game plays a lot. When you start getting yourself into trouble in PathOfExile 2, you will feel it, and you will feel it quicker than you do in PathOfExile 1. In PoE 1, it's pretty easy to get into a situation where you just have a couple of tier 8 maps in a row that are just rolled easier than a typical Elked tier 8, and then your brand new character ends up feeling like it can do not just tier 8s, but tier 9s, 10s, maybe even 11s and 12s. But all this time, you weren't really even ready for the tier 8s. You just happen to have unusually easy rolls, or they had unusually easy monster types in them, and a boss that you're pretty familiar with. As a result, you wound up biting off more than you could chew, but you didn't get immediate feedback on that, and so you don't find out until you start trying a tier 9, tier 10, or tier 11 map, and that is just completely and utterly overwhelming. In PathOfExile 2, I think you're going to feel it a lot earlier if you start biting off more than you can chew, because dying 5% of the time in maps is going to feel really impactful, and it's going to be something you're going to want to stop your progression up in tiers in order to be able to fix. So that's something that's worth keeping in mind. That is really going to change the feel of the game overall. Additionally, it's going to mean that a number of glass cannon metas are not going to develop in PathOfExile 2. Or if they do, they'll be played very, very carefully, rather than this being one of the fastest ways to play the game. Let's talk about some of these other related endgame mechanics that you can see on the Atlas, such as the aforementioned breaches. And let's start by talking about some of the rewards that are associated with breach, as well as some of the challenges that are going to be associated with it as well. Breach is no longer going to have garbage breach rings like it has in PathOfExile 1. Instead, breach rings are being completely reworked, and they're going to be something quite interesting. Breach is gaining quality jewelry as a mechanic. This is going to be something that's being taken out of Ultimatum, and it's going to be given to Breach instead. Breach rings are going to be able to have up to 50 quality on them. This is going to come at the expense of not being able to have a different implicit on them. So you could choose between, for instance, a coral ring, whatever that ends up being in PathOfExile 2 if they do keep it. Let's just assume it's the same as PoE 1 where it has a flat implicit of life. Or instead you could have a breach ring implicit that allows you to get up to 50 quality on it. The latter is probably going to be stronger. if you can craft it appropriately. Now you can also work towards one of the Pinnacle bosses here. This is Zesht, who in PathOfExile 1 is known as Zeshtula, and this is going to be a capstone fight for the Breach mechanic. But unlike a lot of other capstone fights in PathOfExile's history, this is not going to be something you're locked out of until you've got a super powerful character. Instead, the Zesht fight is going to have 4 or 5 different difficulty levels. There's going to be the base level 0 one, which is probably going to be quite accessible, and then you're going to be able to power it up. In fact, whilst we know we can reach level 4, I actually think from looking at the passive tree for Breach, you might be able to hit level 6 on this. And if you can, that will be very, very threatening indeed. Now, the way that this is going to work is that when you defeat Zesht, you'll be able to allocate 2 points into a Breach exclusive tree. Some of these points go into travel nodes, and those travel nodes will give you +1 to the difficulty of the Zesht fight. Other ones will be notables, and they'll do things like increase the number of grasped hands that are present in maps, and give them a percentage chance to be accompanied by a magic monster pack. So you can invest into those clasped hands, or one thing I think people might start doing a bit is just take 2 of the small nodes in order to turbocharge their progression up to harder incarnations of the fight against Zesht. The exact mechanics of that will be something we'll have to work out. Maybe Grinding Games have thought of that, and they don't allow you to just turbocharge your progression to Zesht, but maybe they do. Maybe that's always been their intention. Another mechanic that's coming back from PathOfExile 1 is Ritual. Now, the actual in-map events seem to be quite similar between PathOfExile 1 and PathOfExile 2, except that in PathOfExile 2, you're going to be able to have 5 rituals in a map. At least that seems to be the way it can work. However, the loot that you get is very, very different. And this is where we were talking about metamods before. You can receive currency items that modify the way other currencies work. One example of this is the Omen of Sinistral Exaltation. Now this is something that's shown briefly in one of Grinding Games' videos, and it's a metamod, and it causes it so that when this item is turned on, if you apply an Exalted Orb to an item, and remember Exalts are going to be common in PathOfExile 2, then it will add only prefix modifiers. However, the first Exalted Orb that you use will consume the Omen of Sinistral Exaltation. There is the Omen of Dextral Annulment, which is probably quite a lot rarer. I think Orbs of Annulment are going to be quite rare in PathOfExile 2. This has a reverse effect. It applies to suffixes, and it overwrites the normal effect of an Orb of Annulment by forcing it to only choose a suffix modifier. And there's also another Omen that's hidden in the PathOfExile official announcement, and this is something that's only on the screen for 2 or 3 frames. Unfortunately though, it's not worth the effort that went into finding it. This is the Omen of Greater Exaltation, and while it's active, your next Exalted Orb will add 2 random mods instead of 1. Essentially, that's just giving you another Exalted Orb, and with Exalted Orbs being common, I'm a little bit underwhelmed in that one. Anyways, Ritual is also going to have a Pinnacle boss, and it's also going to have a tree associated with it. The Pinnacle boss here is going to be the King in the Miss, and every time you defeat the King in the Miss, you'll be able to gain passive points you can then invest back into Ritual, which you can then use if you want to juice up the King in the Miss further, make it so that the King in the Miss is both a harder fight and also drops more and better loot. And one thing that Grinding Games has said with this is that there'll be a minimum threshold for certain unique items to drop, and the top tier version, which is going to be what you get if you allocate all of the boosts to the difficulty that you can get to the boss, these will have some sort of very high variance unique item that drops. Examples from PathOfExile 1's history were the Watcher's Eye, All's Uprising, the Uber Maven Jewel. All of these are examples of very, very, very high variance items, and these are likely going to be what the 4th level Uber Pinnacle bosses are going to provide. Delirium is another mechanic that's going to be available in PathOfExile 2 on launch date, and this looks a lot better graphically than it does in PathOfExile 1. It has much more subtle graphics, which is something I really like. Now, Delirium is going to pick up a reward that was previously associated with Blight, and that is the ability to augment your amulet in order to give you 1 additional passive node on it. So Distilled Emotions will essentially replace the oils from PathOfExile 1. However, excess Distilled Emotions can also be applied to maps where they will function like a Delirium Orb does. There's very little other information that was made available about the way Delirium will work, other than it will have Simulacrum as a capstone, and that the Simulacrum will contain Omniphobia, one of the monsters that's coming back from PathOfExile 1. Expedition is going to be returning from PathOfExile 1 as well. This is one that they gave very little information about. Now, you can earn useful items and runic magic from the various NPCs. The 4 NPCs will be back in PathOfExile 2, but the exact nature of the rewards that they offer was not made clear. What runic magic is, we don't know. Presumably it'll be something similar to Kalguran runesmithing that was added in PathOfExile 1 in the Settlers expansion, but we don't know exactly how that'll work. Again, there is a capstone boss here, and that is Olroth. Olroth, when defeated, will award you points, which will then allow you to level up your expeditions, and when you level up your expeditions, also level up both the difficulty and rewards of engaging with this content. Something else that's going to be added is endgame versions of Sanctum and Ultimatum. Now, I mentioned that Sanctum, which is called the Trials of the Sehkma, will be one of the ways that you can ascend, and Ultimatum will be another one. Engaging with the mechanics a small amount in order to achieve your ascension is going to be necessary. But if you want to engage with it more, you'll have the option to go much harder into it. And Sanctum is going to be picking up jewels. Jewels are going to be something that you'll get from the Sanctum. You'll be able to craft them. And you can also craft a number of new types of jewels, such as radius modifying jewels that will exist in PathOfExile 2. Additionally, you can now craft relics. This is one of the things that Grinding Gear Games have mentioned, that a lot of mechanics, because crafting is so powerful in PathOfExile 1, particularly the ability to remove mods and replace them with other ones, they were very, very limited in what they allowed you to craft in certain leagues. And Sanctum was an example of this. You were not allowed to modify relics, which meant that if you got a 1-mod, you couldn't then go and apply an Orb of Augmentation to it. You were just kind of stuck with it as it was. Relics are going to exist in the Sanctum and probably be very important if you're going into the Uber version of Sanctum, or Trial of the Sehkma as it should probably be called, but these relics are going to be something you can roll yourself. Of course, if you want to get a particular mod, you're going to need to find a new relic in order to try and roll that. Now, there's going to be an original sin variant as well, a chase item that's going to exist from the Sanctum, and this is one that I had to slow down Grinding Gear Games' video a lot to find details on. This is going to be called the Last Flame, the relic is anyway, and then it's going to cause Zarok the Eternal, who is presumably the Pinnacle boss of the Sanctum mechanic, to drop an item called Temporalis. No information has been given on what Temporalis might do, but given that it's pedigree, given that it's based upon being a spiritual successor to Original Sin, it's probably going to be something that is in pretty hot demand. Another thing that's interesting is that inscribed ultimatums, which are going to be where the endgame versions of Ultimatum will be, these are going to be much more wide open than they are in PathOfExile 1, where they tend to be all very narrow areas. This, I think, will be a popular decision with a lot of players. In fact, a lot of areas seem to be both quite open but also quite linear, and Grinding Gear Games have mentioned that in maps, when there is a significant backtrack, then chances are that the path that comes to an end, the end of that path, there will be a special chest. So there'll be some sort of consolation prize if you go the wrong way, and you then need to return in order to go and find the correct way that you're meant to go. The next thing that was discussed was the topic of Vaal Orbs. Vaal Orbs are going to be something that you can use to add enchantments to items. Functionally, these are not too dissimilar to the Vaal implicits that exist now, except for one very important difference. They don't remove implicits from the item. With Vaal Orbs, they're just going to provide an enchantment, and so that's going to be all upside, except of course, you're not going to be able to further modify the item. Now, one thing Vaal Orbs can do, they can add these enchantments, but they can also add something akin to abyss sockets on items. These are then going to allow you to socket in a soul core or various runes that will allow the item to be powered up further. The Trial Master is going to be the only source of soul cores, and these are going to be unusual versions of these pseudo abyss jewels. They aren't actually abyss jewels, they just function in a similar way in terms of their in-game effects, and that's why I'm bundling those two together. But the Trial Master is going to be where you get the really good ones, the ones that do unusual and interesting things. One final thing before we move on to Grinding Gear Games' FAQ. There is going to be an endgame Atlas boss that is tied to the Atlas rather than any of these particular mechanics, and this is going to be a boss that's going to have several lieutenants that you're going to need to fight in order to get this boss. Now, there's informed speculation and there's uninformed speculation. This is the latter. This is just uninformed wild speculation, not based on anything Grungy Games has said, but I suspect this is going to be Zana, a character that PathOfExile 1 players may be familiar with if you've played the game for a little while, ever since she was central to the endgame before Kirak took over her role in patch 3.17. I could be completely wrong here, but I've always thought they've had plans for Zana, and given the amount that she sent exiles off into all sorts of mysterious realms, got a bunch of them killed, started wars against various eldritch entities, maybe she is the big bad here. We will find out. Still saying Exile? Sometimes, when you're exploring your way around the world, you'll find a special monolith that looks different to the others. When you do, you'll then find that in this area, there's a number of various factions that are fighting for control over it. These factions are going to be led by tougher versions of act bosses that are then going to be there as mini bosses that you need to fight in order to get access to this boss of the Atlas. But let's just assume it's Zana for a second. Once you defeat your 3 mini bosses that you've got to do based on the various act bosses, then and only then do you gain access to the ability to fight this Pinnacle version of Zana. And then once you take down Zana, you'll be able to spec new points into a new section of the Atlas passive tree and then try and do it again harder. I suspect that this is going to be pretty doable if you're doing the fight at its base level, but that it's going to be brutally tough at the maximum level, and this might be the hardest encounter in the game. This might be something akin to Uber Pinnacle bosses, that step above tier 17 maps, that step above some of the traditional Pinnacle bosses like Uber Elder or the Shaper. So that's a whole bunch of information, but there is still a lot more to go through, and that is Grungy Games' early access FAQ. Now, this has a number of regularly asked questions, and I expect that this might be extended over the next few days, and as that happens, we'll have another look at it and we'll add in things as needed. So, with PathOfExile 2 launching in early access in just 2 weeks, we're sure you got a bunch of burning questions about what to expect. Let's go through this. When does early access start? This is going to start on the 6th of December if you are in the United States and similar time zones, and in the early morning of the 7th of December if, like me, you happen to be Australian. For me, it is bright and early at 6 AM on that Saturday, or at least bright and early. At least it's early. Let's see how bright I actually am getting up at 5 o'clock in order to start playing then. We might end up finding that I'm in my own little messed up world. That said, I'm definitely looking forward to it a lot. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to be available on macOS at the start of early access, but it will exist as a standalone PC client, a Steam client, an Epic Game Store client, Xbox Series client, and also PlayStation 5. How do you get into the early access? Now, if you are a lifetime high spender for PathOfExile 1, then you'll get complimentary access. This is not being granted yet. Their definition of a lifetime high spender is exceeding or equaling or exceeding $480 over the entire duration of your PathOfExile 1 account. If you're in that category, you will receive a forum message at some point, and that will have all the details that you'll need. This will come from Grungy Games. If you do get one that's from some random person, just report it to support if you get something that is dubious, because there will probably be some phishing attacks along those lines. In that case, you'll end up automatically having access to PathOfExile 2 for the early access. But for most people, that's not going to be the case. In that case, Grungy Games are selling a bunch of microtransaction bundles. Okay, this is one where Editing GOG needed to come in and make a little bit of a clarification to get the wording very, very precise so that people don't buy the wrong thing. There are a few packs that are tied to PathOfExile 1's 3.25 Settlers of Kalgurl expansion. Those packs do not include an early access key. There is the First Blood supporter pack. That does not include early access there either. Just check the exact list of pack contents. All of the other ones do, and they're something that you'll be able to check out on the PathOfExile official site. Just have a look through at the microtransaction bundle you're interested in and see if it contains what you're after. Also, fun little bonus, some of the higher packs, starting with the $160 one, contain additional access codes that you can use if you want one of your friends to be able to join you in early access as well. I don't believe that you'll be allowed to sell those. That's going to be something that we'll find out over time. How will I know if I'm eligible for this complimentary access for being a lifetime high spender? You can have a check at this by visiting your account on the PathOfExile 1 official website. This interface is pretty clunky because it's going to be crowded out with all of the individual microtransaction purchases that you've made. So for instance, if you've purchased 4 supporter packs over time, and you've made 172 different individual purchases from the MTX store, including buying a Weta every time that there is one of the free mystery box bundles, then in that case, you'll have to go through nearly 200 lines of text in order to track down this information. There are some scripts that are going around that will parse this for you. Please do not run these unless you have enough programming experience to read through them and to verify that they do exactly what they say they'll do. Even if it's sent to you by someone that you trust, I do not want to see accounts get compromised because someone clicks on a bad link. The other thing that you should keep in mind is that you will receive both an email and a forum message if you qualify, but that this is not coming immediately. This is something that you will get closer to the time that it starts. What happens if you've merged sub-accounts? This is actually something that I didn't think would be the case. This is working the worst possible way for players. It does not count the different purchases consolidated. It's only if one individual sub-account reached this $480 threshold. Can you purchase new supporter packs on consoles? Yes, you can on Xbox now. You can claim MTX for PathOfExile 1, and you'll also get access to early access to downloading PoE 2, but you won't be able to start playing it until the 6th of December. There are, however, going to be a couple of little changes to the very top of the various MTX bundles, so have a look into that if you're playing on that realm. Supporter packs for Sony realms, so PlayStation 4 and 5, will not become available until December 6th. At that point, then it launches in early access, and at that point, you'll be able to buy a supporter pack if you want. How do I redeem a key? There's a couple of different configurations for this, and I'll put a link to the FAQ. If you're in a situation where this matters to you, you'll be able to have a look at that there. When can you download the client? This one's really important. It will be available to download a few days prior to the actual launch. You won't be able to play it until the 6th of December, but you'll be able to download it a few days in advance. This is going to be important, especially if, like me, you are stuck with Australian internet. What content is going to be included in the game? We've kind of already discussed this so far. So it's going to include the campaign, which is going to be 3 acts, and then repeating those 3 acts at the moment. That's sort of half the campaign. Then the endgame is going to include 50 bosses, 400 monster types, and they're intending to roughly double this during early access and into the release. How long will early access run? Granny Gear Games have said they kind of don't want it to be going for 12 months, but they do expect it's going to take at least 6 months. Ultimately, it will go into a full launch and become a free-to-play game once they feel that it's ready for that. That's likely going to take Acts 4, 5, and 6 all being released, and probably a couple more different endgame functionalities as well. So maybe there'll be 2 or 3 more systems that are added to endgame. What's going to happen with respect to couch cooperative play? Yes, you can play couch co-op from day one. You'll be able to do this straight away, including 2 characters on the same account. Will it be wipes during early access? One of the things that people who played during the Fall of Oriath beta might be aware of is that they did have a couple of wipes during that. They're committing here that there will be no wipes during this beta. However, it is very important to note that characters will not go into the same permanent standard as characters that get made after the game goes into full release. So essentially, you will still be able to play your characters from early access in the future, but they will be quarantined off from characters that are made once the game goes into full release. This only matters if you're a Standard League player, if you're someone who likes to build on your characters over a long period of time, because PathOfExile 2 early access will probably have some big design mistakes in it, and they don't want those getting into the permanent standard. Of course, there'll be future design mistakes as well. Granny Gear Games will always make some things that are too strong and that they end up nerfing, and likely legacy versions of those items will exist in the future standard, but there'll be nothing that you can't get if you don't play during the early access period. Do you need to make a new account to play PathOfExile 2 in early access? The answer to this is no if you're an established PathOfExile 1 player, and yes if you're not a PathOfExile 1 player. What will happen to my PathOfExile 1 microtransactions in early access? And this is MTX that excludes stash tabs. We'll answer the stash tab question in a sec. The answer is that yes, they will work in early access, but not all of them are ready to use yet. Most recently introduced ones will work. All stash tabs will work, except for a couple that don't yet make sense in PathOfExile 2. But due to a massive backlog of microtransactions from PathOfExile 1, they're still being added into PathOfExile 2 over time, so many of them will be unavailable early on. One thing I'm really hoping to see here, one of my favorite character looks in PathOfExile 1, has been a favorite for a long time, is the black character armor and the white character effect. It's a really simple, really crisp, really clean look, and it's something that I hope is available from day one. Likewise, the Sin and Innocence armor set, one of my favorites from PathOfExile 1, definitely hoping to see how it looks on the higher definition characters in PathOfExile 2. One thing that's not really touched upon here, there will be some MTX that just don't make sense in PathOfExile 2. For example, we've seen no indication that Flame Dash is transferring across to PathOfExile 2. It may not, but let's just assume for a second that it doesn't. In that case, Scientist Flame Dash is an MTX that I know I have, and this is one that won't apply in PathOfExile 2 unless they do end up adding Flame Dash in. How my stash tabs from PathOfExile 1 work in PathOfExile 2. Stash tabs purchased in PathOfExile 1 will be available in PathOfExile 2 where they are relevant. For example, a special League-related stash tab may not be available in PathOfExile 2 as that content does not exist there. We'll be updating applicable stash tabs in PoE 2, and stash tabs, like the currency stash tab, will hold different items to what they do in PathOfExile 1. Stash tabs will become remove only if you're logged in on a different platform where you don't own them. I think that is only referring to the situation that will come up if you jump around between playing on PC and PlayStation. I think that might be what they're talking about there. I'm not exactly certain what that means. Maybe that's PathOfExile 1. Whatever the case, this is something I wouldn't mind seeing some clarification on this, but I think it only applies to people who are dual console or console plus PC players. Will I be able to buy new microtransactions? Yes, the cosmetic shop will be available in early access with a selection of microtransactions from PoE 1. At the moment, we're not intending to introduce new microtransactions for PathOfExile 2 yet, but there will be many more added later. Is there any non-disclosure agreement? No, there is not. You're welcome to show the content to whoever you want, but please bear in mind that this is content that is still being worked on, and so may end up being changed substantially before the game goes into full release, or may even in some cases get outright removed. One thing that really surprised me here though, will I be able to purchase a unique item or divination card design for PathOfExile 2? Yes, but in very limited quantities at a later date. This really surprised me. I did not think Granny Games wanted to have these commissions back in. These are something that caused them a bunch of trouble in PathOfExile 1. I'm expecting that the prices on these could be extraordinarily steep. Keep that in mind if that's something that you are thinking of going for. I wouldn't be surprised to see unique item commissions. Like they had them at 2,500 American the last time they were being sold. And even at that price, they withdrew them from sale because they found that it was just creating a huge amount of work. So it wouldn't surprise me if they go for something like 5,000 American dollars there, and divination card commissions might be in the 1,000 or more range as well. They're a lot less work than the unique items are, but they are still a significant amount. All that said, be interesting to see what exactly they do there, and in particular, what restrictions they place on unique item commissions, and also on divination cards, because there are a number of restrictions in PathOfExile 1. Anyways, that completes the tour of all of the news related to PathOfExile 2, except for one little piece of info, and that is that you can download the press kit here from PathOfExile.com if you are the sort of person that wants to have a whole bunch of wallpapers to display on your PC with all sorts of artwork, including some of these images that you've seen here, which have come out of the press kit. This is a boss called Lemurius, or at least I assume it's a boss, maybe it's an NPC. This is key art for the Witch's Blood Mage Ascendancy. This is for the Infernalist. These are some of the best ones, but there are a whole bunch of other ones as well. So that's definitely worthwhile having a look at. It's a 1.25 gig download, so may not be instant if your internet's as bad as mine is, but it is definitely something that's worth having a look at and that might give you a few artistic things to take out of this as well. Anyways, that is the PathOfExile 2 summary of all of the announcements today. I'm going to leave it there. I am not going to have fun editing this. This is going to be a horrible experience to edit because I've got to go through almost an hour of raw footage. Let's see how much that cuts down. I don't think it's going to be all that much. I just think there's a lot in this, but we shall find out. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results, and may they add interesting enchantments to your PathOfExile 2 items.